Okay, this is going to be the last of the sort of chapter 1 or module 1 PowerPoints. I think I can squish this all into one. We'll see. So it's sort of actually covering two related concepts. The first is understanding that the Western tradition, i.e. the Euro-American intellectual tradition, which you guys learn in school and that type of stuff, actually has an inherent set of biases. I think this is especially true in the United States. If you look at, for example, British universities, they oftentimes have some sort of a discussion about this. I don't remember ever having seen this at all in, at university in the US. And I'm not really sure why it isn't part of the discussion. It strikes me that there'd be a lot less confusion down the road if you actually had that discussion. So I'll have a very quick and dirty version of it. I suspect all the terms that you see on this panel, you could probably do even like a Wikipedia search and probably find some interesting stuff. Certainly psychic unity is just pretty trippy when you actually start to think about it. So you have to remember that when you're talking about bias, what you're talking about is bias isn't necessarily good or evil. Bias is just bias. Bias just means that when you're looking at something, you have a set of preconceptions or filters that you use when you're examining something. As we'll see, this is what theories are. Theories are a form of bias. So when someone talks about a particular theoretical approach, and so they'll say that's what they use, as we'll see later in this. That's actually saying these are the biases that I have. These are the things that I think are important, and that's why I looked at it this way. And what that's also, of course, implying is a bunch of stuff that I didn't because those aren't part of my biases, or maybe my bias says they're not important. So bias, understanding that everything is biased and understanding that everyone is biased is really, really critical, because if you do that, then you can sort of understand what the other person's thinking or why they say something the way that they do. Mind you, just because you understand bias doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But if you refuse to accept that someone does have a different set of biases, then you might as well just talk to a wall. You're never going to have any interaction with that person because the two of you don't have a common shared point of understanding. Understanding isn't acceptance in the sense of buying into something. Understanding is simply that you understand that someone can see something differently, for example, than you can. Something that sadly seems to be missing in the United States right now. So there's a whole series set of biases that actually underlie Western science. And again, I don't understand why you don't see these brought up more. But it's a real peculiar sort of Americanism to assume that science is somehow rational, based in data and fact, and therefore some sort of reflecting immutable reality, when in fact it has a whole set of pre-selective choices that have been made and assumptions underlie it. First, and the biggest one, is this idea of uniformitarianism, that the planet is and everything in the universe is basically in a uniform structure. And you have to remember, this is because Western science comes out of Christianity. More specifically, Western science comes out of Roman Catholicism. So the Western scientific tradition, of course, if you go back to the medieval period, was originally based in monasteries. That's where the intellectuals were. It was your Jesuits and the other intellectual orders that basically sort of reinterpreted, Greco-Roman and other types of early thought, and then sort of filtered it within the Catholic tradition. And so one of the key aspects of that then is the idea that God made the world and the universe in, I think, 7 days. And so therefore, everything was made at a point in time in a particular way. So therefore, everything should be uniform because it's made at the same point in time in the same way. So that's uniformitarianism. Now, for many folks, this is something they would never think about. But for example, if you're, we'll say you're doing some experiment in chemistry class and you're mixing two chemicals together. If you mix these two reagents in a particular way, you should get X. And the reason for it is because every time it's been done before, that's what happens. So when you do it right, it should happen the same way. The idea that water flows downhill, that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, I think that's how it works. So all that stuff would be uniformitarianism. So the idea that the sun always rises and always sets. The idea that water always flows from uphill to downhill. Those principles are seen as being immutable in the Western intellectual tradition. That's uniformitarianism. And this is why you get the Western fascination with coming up with laws of physics, laws of chemistry, laws of astrodynamics, whatever it might be, with the idea that you're trying to define these immutables. This is really a big part of what Western science and social science does. The social sciences, and that's why they're called that, anthropology, sociology, psychology, were based on the idea that you could find laws of human behavior. And therefore, and once you found those laws, they would apply to people all the time. And that's why there was such a big search for them in the, say, the 18 and 1900s. So uniformitarianism really underlies Western thought. Now, eventually, of course, science supposedly wanders away from Christianity or Catholicism per se, but it still keeps this underlying premise. If you go out of the Judeo-Christian Islamic intellectual package, on which I'll share this uniformitarianism, then you don't see it. In the Asian tradition, there's no idea that the world's uniform. There's no idea that things are going to be the same in one place just because they happen in another place. I grew up in part in a tradition which doesn't believe the sun necessarily rises unless you pray it out of the ground. So in that context, there's no idea that the sun should rise unless people make an effort to get it to rise. That was very true, for example, in Polynesia. Traditionally, in most of Polynesia, people prayed for the sun to come. With the assumption that if they didn't make some effort, it wouldn't just show up because it was, it's Friday or something like that. So uniformitarianism is a very peculiarly Western concept. You don't see it in the rest of the world, pretty much without exception. In the rest of the world, things are a lot more problematic. They're a lot more situational. They're a lot more maybes. There's not a lot of givens. And that, if you think about it for a second, that radically changes your world if you live in a world where you're not sure what's going to happen when you wake up in the morning, except that you can be pretty sure that today probably won't be like yesterday because there's no thing that guarantees today should be like yesterday. You're in a very different mindset, say the classic American mindset, where people get upset because today is different than yesterday. They assume that things should be the same unless they want them to change. So a very, very different view of that. Subsets of that. When you apply this, not surprisingly, again, with this idea of the creationism, the world occurs at a point in time made by the divine. And then what you're also going to get then is, of course, every animal, plant, especially we'll say animals, then starts at sort of point A. And everything in that species or related types of things then can evolve. It can change and usually modify, and oftentimes sort of seen as a new and improved version over time. So mammals are supposedly some sort of more evolved version of dinosaurs. Okay, so that's unilinear evolution. That's evolution. Now, because of this idea of this creationist background, idea of the uniform, what happens is you get the idea of what we call unilinear evolution, that everything on the planet basically occurred starting at X, and therefore there was a standard process by which change occurred, and which change always occurs sort of the same way. It might vary from species to species, object to object, but the process of change is uniform. So this is the idea of unilinear evolution, or uni meaning one and then linear. So train tracks, think of a set of train tracks. Everyone goes down the train tracks, or in this case, everything goes down the train tracks. And that sort of underlies the basic principles of Darwinian selection, this idea that there's a uniform process that everything went through, and the process remains the same. The way different species, for example, handle it varies. But that becomes a major part of what evolutionary guys look at. Evolutionary biologists are fascinated with the variations in the results, not the variations in the processes. See the processes being pretty much standardized. In the 1820s, 1830s, since this was a basic principle, what happened is actually Darwin's sort of sponsor, I guess he was, his teacher, Spencer, a guy named Spencer, actually came up with an earlier version of what becomes Darwinian natural selection, but he applies it to people. In Spencer's view, he takes the idea of evolution, which was already fairly popular at the time, and applies it to societies or groups. So in Spencer's view of the world, some people were more evolved than other people. Some groups were more evolved than other groups. And of course, this becomes what you still see to a certain extent, for example, in a classic history text. You have the Stone Age, you have the Neolithic or New Stone Age, and then you have the Bronze Age, and then you have the Iron Age, and you have the Age of Technology, and all these different ages. But what's sort of implicit in that is that some groups don't make the jump. So for example, in the 1770s, when the Europeans discover Hawaii, the Hawaiians were, quote, in the Stone Age. The Europeans were in, I suppose, for lack of a better term, the Iron Age, or some sort of metallurgical period. So therefore, the Europeans were more advanced than the Hawaiians because they had more technology, but it also meant their society was more evolved. So this is the idea of some folks being more primitive than other folks. That's the concept of social evolution. Now, it's very convenient if you're the group that's scoring all this and you just happen to have this things that make you look good be the top of the heap. So, for example, this was a British theory originally. This is very handy if you're the British Empire in the 19th century, where you control a large part of the planet. You can control the whole subcontinent of India and argue that it's actually your logical right because you're more socially evolved than you see the Indians, the populations in India be. So therefore, it's what you should do to do that. The missionary Euro largely Anglo-American presence here in the 19th century was based on the idea of social evolution. That the missionaries and the other folks coming over here felt they had the obligation, since they were more advanced, more sophisticated, to bring the Hawaiians out of primitive Stone Age times and bring them into the 19th century. This is also, for example, if you don't want to actually bother with that, the flip side of that is you then erase a group. If you decide that a group is so primitive that they're not worth the trouble of helping up, then you just liquidate them. And this is the reason for a lot of the genocide that you see in the last 1,000 or whatever years. Is this idea of social evolution, that you either you score groups and you use a set of criteria. Now, if you were Hawaiian, you'd use a different set of criteria, and Hawaiians would look more advanced than the Anglo-Americans. But that's the way it plays out. So social evolution, unilateral evolution, central to Western thought, but it's a bias, and it's not true of other groups. Other groups don't have this. It doesn't exist in the American intellectual traditions, i.e. in the Native American, in Asian, et cetera, et cetera. Psychic unity. Psychic unity is sort of an offshoot of this, but it's based on the same principle, that if you have a divine figure make the whole planet and everything in it in a point in time, then all the members of that particular species, in this case the human species, will be sort of copies of each other. So if you want to think about it, all human beings are like an iPhone 10. They're all built the same way. They all work the same way. They've got the same sensors. They've got the same cameras. They've got the same operating system, whatever. This is the idea of psychic unity. It's basically that in our particular species, everyone's brains work the same way. Our senses work the same way, and therefore how we see the world around us is pretty much the same. Now, this again is an underlying principle in Western tradition, and especially in the cases like psychiatry, defines the discipline. If you have, behavioral issues, someone's going to go and give you probably what they call the DSM test, which is the diagnostic test that they give for folks to measure their normality, I guess, for lack of a better term. And that particular test is this huge book, which basically defines, whether your responses to a set of standardized questions fit within the standardized norm. Now, you can only have that idea of a box with standardized norms if you have the idea of psychic unity. And again, that's unique to the Western religion, the Judeo-Christian Islamic Western religious tradition. In other places, you don't have that. And as we'll see probably a little bit somewhere in the semester, well, actually, you did see a little bit, the Japanese one. Japanese don't have that. So in the Japanese tradition, you don't have a concept of psychic unity. So when Japanese deal with other Japanese, they don't assume that they think the same way. They don't assume their brains operate the same way. They don't even assume they actually see the same world around them, which means you're going to treat other people a lot different, because all of a sudden the word stranger in many societies would sort of be a synonym for the word alien. The only way you're going to figure out whether that other person is actually normal is to get to know them, which if you deal with a lot of societies is why you have to go through a whole very complicated set of relationships where people get to know each other, then they'll feel comfortable with each other. Why? Because they don't assume that there's some commonality in terms of behavior and expectations. And if you think about it, that little gate box thing you saw is a good example of that. If you're Japanese in 2020, especially now with COVID, and you have a hard time interacting with people, then what could possibly make you more comfortable than an artificial intelligence hologram that will basically be your life companion? It's very easy to learn. It takes advantage of, it structures you. And of course, unlike most things in Japanese society, you can assume that that particular set of code, i.e. the app that runs that thing, is pretty standardized. So in a society, in a concept system which doesn't have psychic unity, robots can be real attractive. Real people, on the other hand, can be very stressful. Just something to think about. Sociobiology, this again is one of the really basic concepts. It's a huge part of what anthropologists deal with. It usually just aggravates us to no end. Sociobiology is basically the idea that social behaviors are biologically coded. So the one I always use in class would be if someone has real artistic ability, invariably people will say, oh, you must have got that from, say, your dad's side of the family because your auntie is so artistic, so you must have inherited it. There are a few things which are inherited, hand-eye coordination, for example, to a certain extent. Physical size and musculature would be obviously, but all the rest of the stuff isn't. So there's no evidence that sociobiology exists in the testing, but nonetheless, everyone believes sociobiology to be true. Now, in one way, shape, or form, I don't really know of too many groups that don't have some sort of concept of the idea that you inherit behavior. That if you have a temper, that's actually a result of maybe your mom's side of the family, because your mom's side of the family tends to go off all the time. So, you inherited that. All the studies suggest that by contrary, you actually acquire that by virtue of background and a whole set of other complex factors. So it's not genetically programmed into you. It's something that you acquire in some way, shape, or form. Having said that, almost every group has a very strong concept that sociobiology is, quote, real. What makes it very complicated, however, is if you look from one group to the other, they don't agree on what the real is. So Chinese, for example, have a very different view of what is sociobiologically acquired versus a sort of what you might call, urban folklore American logic, which is also very different than what you'd find, for example, in some place like Greece or Italy. So sociobiology, it's like every group agrees on the fact that it exists, but what they can't agree is what it is. Having said that, you have to be very aware that sociobiology is something that every group believes in. And if you're dealing with a group you're not familiar with, one of the first things you got to do is try to figure out, okay, what is their version of sociobiology? Because invariably, people don't think about it. They just assume it to be the case. And you end up looking really stupid if you're not aware of how they sort of mentally process all that. Ethnocentrism, cultural relativism. Cultural relativism just means that when you look at another group, you try really hard to look at the individual and the people you're watching's behavior within the rules that you understand or the norms that apply to that group. It's not really the flipped ethnocentrism, but it's sometimes seen as like an alternative. I don't know. I think Henry has actually a real good discussion of that in her thing. I think that the guy that I showed you the link for the videos, I think he's got one there that actually talks about that. Ethnocentrism is the key one. And this is a huge part of what anthropologists try to deal with. To a certain extent, our translation, the job of anthropology to translate other societies, to translate other groups, is to try to reduce the amount of ethnocentrism when one's interacting with others. Now, having said that, we're all ethnocentric. Ethnocentrism is based in the upbringing and background that you have, and it basically says that whatever you're brought up with, you have a tendency to view different people, in other words, different groups, different places, whatever, from the context of what you're used to. Now, when you think about it, it makes sense. I mean, you're gonna have to view other groups within some framework, and the most logical one is what you think of as normal. So if you're American, like when you guys were watching the Hatsune Miku, a lot of the responses back and the reactions pointed out that the Hatsune Miku one initially seems seriously weird. But then if you watch it a little bit, as a couple of folks did and actually went and watched longer concerts, then the whole thing starts to make a little sense. It doesn't mean you have to like her. It doesn't even mean you have to think it's a good idea. But if you can get to understand the motivations of the audience and why something like that makes sense to them, then you've overcome a certain amount of ethnocentrism. So ethnocentrism is the judgment we put on the behavior and whatever of others based on our own set of experiences, which we consider to be the norm or normal. And of course, that means the other stuff is seen as abnormal. We're all ethnocentric because we all base our judgment of others based on our own background. It's just part parcel of it. But being aware of when you're being ethnocentric and being aware of when it's shaping how you're interacting with someone else is a huge part of what becoming an anthropologist is about. So it's not that I'm not ethnocentric, but I am supposed to, if I'm any good, I'm supposed to be aware and be sensitive to when my ethnocentrism is kicking in. When I start looking at some Chinese guy doing something, I'm thinking like, dude, that's like really strange. Is it strange, or is it just that I think it's strange? Okay. I already mentioned this idea that theory is just a set of biases. Kuhn's paradigm, you can Google this. Kuhn was I think he was a scientific historian. So he was a guy that studied history of science in the 20th century sometime, I think early I'm going to say 1930s, 1950s, maybe. And what he pointed out is, if I think he was looking, I think he was looking at biology or some aspect of chemistry or something. I don't remember exactly what, but he pointed out that despite the sort of the fable, which is that Western science, you know, you build on the work of others and you come in new directions, and it's all sort of this, you know, like a tree or something like that. He pointed to reality is what is science was fads. People in a particular discipline would come into something. Someone would come up with some new idea, and a whole mess of folks would jump on the bandwagon. For a while, that'd be the way things were done. Then everyone would sort of look around and go like, dude, this is really sort of weird. And then they go off in another direction. So science didn't consist of sort of linear, ironically, it's a unilinear evolutionary perspective, you know, or increasing quality. It was like boingy, boingy, boingy. In fact, it was the image he used was of a pendulum swinging back and forth between two poles. And the only reason that Kuhn's paradigm is important is that it applies in all disciplines. In other words, we see it in all disciplines. And it sort of puts the lie to the idea that scientific rigor somehow is based in reality. If you're jumping onto bandwagons and fads, that's not data-driven reality. It's being part of the human species. So it's just sort of a warning, flashing light that the Western scientific tradition has its own set of, I don't know what you might call cultural or sort of ethos baggage attached to it. Okay, so let's get into the theory part. Again, remember what I said, theory is bias. Anthropology is one of the older disciplines. It originally was sort of part of geography in the Western tradition. So you find that the Egyptians, for example, were big into it. The Greeks are probably the most famous. They were the first folks, and even, of course, we're still using the word anthropos for that Greek. So the Greeks were the first group that actually, guys spent a whole, you know, careers writing about other groups of people and how they operated. And in many cases, they were doing this sort of like, you know, popular novels. They were writing this stuff so that other Greeks could read this and go like, damn, these people are strange. But they knew it was popular. People wanted to read about other groups of people doing weird stuff. So what you find is the Greeks were very big on studying people because they found that people were interested in hearing about people. And so this is the idea, they came up with the word barbaric, the idea of barbaros, which of course is very ethnocentric. They thought everyone who wasn't Greek was less than a Greek. But in that process, then you do it a fair amount of time and effort to write about these other guys and examine and try to figure out why they acted the way they did. In other words, why weren't they Greek? Why wouldn't they be Greek when obviously Greek was supposed to be the best? Herodotus is probably the most famous of this. But this was a real tradition, the Greek system. Now, the interesting thing is the Romans don't get into this. For whatever reason, they had this huge empire. The Romans weren't big on talking about other groups of people. They pretty much pounded the crap out of folks and said you're, you know, like surrogate Roman. They didn't see the value in other societies, even if they were oddities. So this was very much the Greek tradition. This all sort of goes bum, 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 you know, the medieval period all sort of disappears. And the Judeo-Christian intellectual system, it really wasn't a big thing in the medieval period. So it isn't until you get in this European, I think they call it the Age of Exploration or something, the Age of Discovery, I can't remember what, in the, you know, starting in the 14, 15, 1600s, when you get Europeans starting to wander around the rest of the planet and find other groups, that you see Europeans sort of reinventing the concept of anthropology. They start getting interested in these other groups. Now, in their case, unlike the Greeks, and much of it was purely mercenary. Initially, they wanted to do trade, and if you're going to do trade with a group, you better figure out how that group operates, otherwise you can't trade with them. Not too much later, then, of course, they start to colonize or take over these areas, and then you need to understand these other groups so that you, one, can manage them if they're new colonies, and two, if you want to explain why and justify why you have the right to, you know, beat the crap out of them or otherwise take control of them, then you do that by talking about the others. So anthropology becomes one of the mainstays of the colonial logic of the European period, and also one of the mainstays for justifying, you know, sort of innate cultural superiority. So it was a real convenient way to really pump up ethnocentrism and make it sort of a morally logical, good thing to do. So in this, what you have is starting in the 1800s is the development of anthropology as a discipline. When the studying the other becomes, you know, not only acceptable, but it becomes something people really sort of get into. And so early anthropology sort of splits. Early anthropology in Europe is studying European colonial possessions. So if you're a French anthropologist, you study Algerians, or you study the Berbers in North Tunisia, or you study folks in the Western Pacific and the French territories. If you're British, you study some of their colonial possessions, so you study Madrasi and South Madras or something like that. In the American tradition, it was very different. And this is why American anthropology is very different than European anthropology. So European anthropology is usually called social anthropology. So it initially studies colonial possessions, and then it comes back and studies the home group. So you're sort of doing a contrast to compare, you know, the folks in Madras in the south of India are like this. Really good folks like the English people who are in charge are like this. In the American tradition, since you have to remember the Anglo-Americans are migrants, they've only at this point in time, they've only been in the United States for maybe 200 years. What they tend to study is Indians. So in the Anglo-American tradition, there's not a lot of study done of Anglo-Americans. What it is minority groups. And the only minority group they're initially interested in, because they're sort of, well, they just don't see the other groups as being sad enough even being of value, is to study Native Americans, because at some point they've got to justify the fact that they've taken over a whole continent from them. So American anthropology right from the get-go is basically almost like Indian studies. So in that context, regardless of whether it's the British, the French, or the Americans, when you read the stuff, it all sort of looks the same. It's descriptions. I went and hung out with the Sac and Fox, Indians in eastern Pennsylvania in 1892, and this is how they do this, and this is how they did it, and some of that stuff is actually really, really useful, if for no other reason that group maybe largely disappeared or those values have disappeared. So these sort of very descriptive ways of doing stuff are really handy nowadays, because in many cases it's 100 plus 150 years since then, and we don't even have that. So on the other hand, you're not really trying to explain anything. You're not explaining why the Sac and Fox have this attitude towards water, for example. That's not true of, say, Cherokee groups further south. So you're not really trying to do a intellectual analysis. You're just sort of recording information. And that's sort of what early anthropology was. So at some point, it really wasn't very theoretical. The only bias was this group is pretty weird and has some of the weird stuff they do. But then when they actually got to get into the discussion, there's not a lot of obvious bias, except that then a lot of times they don't understand it because they're watching what another group's doing from the standpoint of being Anglo-American or being British or French. So when you're reading this stuff, you always have to be very careful, because you've got to remember that they're so ethnocentric, but they're not even aware of their ethnocentrism because that term didn't even exist then. So that's early anthropology, would be this descriptive. Now, by the mid-19th century, this wasn't satisfactory. People started saying, well, okay, this is really nice that you've got these studies done of, for example, Hindu religion in southeastern India. But then people are saying, well, why do they do that? Like a bunch of little kids, everyone starts going, why? And just saying what it is isn't enough. People want to understand the logic behind it. In other words, why are these people exotic? Why are these people the other? What's behind it? And the first theoretical response to this is the one I mentioned earlier. That's Spencer with this idea of social evolution. Well, these folks in India just aren't as, sophisticated, advanced as such and such. And so in this old primitive belief system, they still do da-da-da-da-da-da. When they become more developed or advanced, of course, they would, quote, lose that and acquire the same stuff as their British, lords and masters who run India at the time. And that, if you're British, since you have to remember most of your intellectuals printing this stuff, the universities themselves, the guys teaching this, are all pretty much from either European or American tradition. It makes them feel real good about themselves. Yeah, we're in charge and we should be in charge. And here's this stuff that actually shows why. Problem is, of course, very quickly is it's self-justification gets really boring, one, to read. And two, it's so obviously full of really big holes you could drive a truck through. Because it still doesn't really explain why. It just explains this group is a bunch of losers compared to you, but it doesn't explain why they did that. So what happened is social evolution pretty quickly sort of goes stutter, thump. And it gets replaced in anthropology by what we call functional schools of theory. This is still a huge part of anthropology. It's never really faded out. But it goes like this, and this would be that people have a series of innate needs. Again, remember this uniform and psychic unity thing. In those needs, most of what people do as groups is to satisfy those needs. So for example, people live in houses or structures. Why? Because people need shelter to survive. People eat food. Why? Because people need food to survive. So therefore, what you look at when you're watching a group do something is you have to figure out what the functional aspects of it are. So again, go to your Hatsune Miku, or even better, the Gatebox one, since the Gatebox to me is a lot more trippy. If you go to the Hatsune Miku one, then if you're an anthropologist from a functional approach or a structural functional approach, same diff, you're going to look at that concert and what it is and try to figure out what obvious purposes does it serve to the audience to pay the money and go see this. And you're assuming that there's some very functional thing that you can come up with, and that becomes your goal as an anthropologist. Well, it's like a detective. Okay, here's what you've got. What's the logic behind it? And that logic's always going to have a function that makes practical sense. It's on part of the basis of human survival. That worked for a while. That was hugely popular for about 50 years, and it's sort of gone like this. Again, Kuhn's paradigm. Right now, functionalism again is a really big thing. But one of the problems you get into with functionalism is a lot of stuff doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense from a functional standpoint, especially anything to do with religion or belief is really hard to make functional sense of, especially when you look at the enormous diversity of religion and belief systems globally. Then all of a sudden, functionalism looks really lame. Because you can watch a religious ceremony or ritual or things that people are doing. They say it's religious, and you start thinking like, okay, that's really sort of, how do I make that functional? And in most cases, you can't. You can come up with some BS, but it's not going to work. So the flip of that sort of grew out of especially the post-World War I period, when people were becoming pretty cynical, a bunch of stuff, government, everything else, very much like what you hear right now. In that context, what you got was a group of folks that basically said, all these types of approaches are highly biased. In other words, this was the first group that defines what I was talking about earlier. And they basically say along with that is that because everyone is inherently biased, that you have to look at things from the standpoint of what they do for that individual. You can't worry about whether it's functional. You just have to say, well, this is how this person experiences, and this is why they do it or why they think they do it. And that's sort of what it is. This became what we call the phenomenological or existential schools. Jean-Paul Sartre is probably the most famous. This is my particular background, is this. So it's the idea that each phenomenon or each thing that you're looking at is actually different because the individuals in it are different people. So therefore, the motivations, the biases, etc., will vary. Now, you can still compare them to one another, but you always have in the back of your mind that just because they look similar to you doesn't mean they're necessarily all that similar to the folks that are doing it. So they might not be doing it for the same reason. On the other hand, they might be. So when you're doing a phenomenological or existential approach to this, oftentimes called experiential, what you're trying to do is actually, when you see something, you're trying to figure out, one, by asking these people, what is this does for you? Again, giving this in-out approach, you're also looking at this. Does this seem to serve a similar need to what I saw maybe another group or another thing this group was doing in another regard? There's a great book I'm reading right now on Japanese Shinto belief systems, or actually Shinto Buddhist systems tied to the Inari, which is the famous fox spirit, which you see all over Japan. And if you go to the really big shrine, the Fukushima Inari Shrine in Kyoto, there's this huge, probably the most famous religious shrine in all of Japan, or one of them. With just these massive foxes all over the place, and that's some really famous one of the Tories. You can go to some great YouTube videos on the the Inari Shrine in Kyoto. Just type in the Inari Shrine and find it. And so when you're looking at that particular thing, you then have to try to see, well, if a group of people are at a little Shinto shrine that's got some fox statues on it, is that actually related to other people in another part of Japan with a shrine with fox statues on it? And the reality of the book that I'm reading, which is really well done anthropological analysis, they're not necessarily. The people have taken those fox figures, but what they make out of the fox, which they see as spirits, or kami, the Japanese would call them, or almost sort of amaku in the Hawaiian sense, is very, very different based on which group of people is, how they're using it, and how they're interpreting it. So that's a phenomenological existentialist approach. Functionalists would just say, well, all the Inari shrines and the way they have to do something with foxes has to do with some sort of basic built human need that you then could discover and elucidate. When you're done, you should have some sort of package, fox spirits mean this in Japan. And that'd be it. So two very, very different ways of looking at that. Running parallel to all this in the early 20th century is Marxism. This is actually classic Karl Marx and Engels. And what they're looking at is labor. They're looking at the history of labor. And you have to remember when you're talking about labor, we'll get into this later when we get into politics and such and economics, is labor is the amount of effort that people spend on something. The Marxist approach said that one of the most important aspects of human culture was basically controlling people's labor. Controlling them in terms of where they're going to spend it, how they're going to spend it, who's going to benefit from it. If you think about it, you're doing this right now. You're taking this class. You're at university. That's time and effort that you're spending on something, and in almost all cases, money too. And of course, money is just a reflection of labor. So from the Marxist approach, the fact that you're at university is a reflection that in one way or another, you're part of a system which argues that going to university has some sort of inherent social economic advantage. And if you're a Marxist anthropologist, what you want to look at is how does the effort and time that you have getting stuck into university benefit you, or does it at all? And if it doesn't benefit you, then who does it benefit and why, and how is that reflected in the values of the society? So Marxist stuff sort of runs parallel to the other trends. It doesn't necessarily get into them too much. If you're looking at particular aspects of particular societies, for example, the work that I do with the Chinese stuff is very, very Marxist, not so much because Mao Zedong was a Marxist, but because when you're looking at the early Chinese state, the government system that ran China, a labor approach is really handy in understanding why people would build a Great Wall, why they'd build these enormous tombs in China, because the emperor could control the power of an entire country and basically say, do it. And the fact that the mass majority of the population, like millions and millions of people, would put up with someone telling them what to do, is part of this idea of what Marxists actually look at, which is the whole structure of how societies control labor and how people are told to use their time versus what individually they might want to do with their time. Postmodernist, postmodernist. I think, I don't know, YouTube this, you might find some really funny little videos on it. Postmodernism is a trend that starts in the 1970s or 80s. It's sort of what you might call an anthropological verb of political correctness. It basically says that all anthropology done before the 1980s is bad because it's biased, and therefore you've got to do some sort of non-biased form of anthropology. If you remember what I said earlier, this is sort of hard to do because everyone's biased. Even the postmodernists are biased. So I would just say, if you see someone who says they're coming from a postmodernist perspective, smile, give them a candy, figure out what their actual biases are, and then pay attention to them. Don't assume that they've got something valuable to say just because they say, I'm a postmodernist. It was very, very trendy. It's sort of starting to fade now because it really doesn't do anything. What you do is you just sort of critically crap on everyone else's work, but you don't come up with new solutions. And at some point, it's not very theoretical if you're just dissing on everyone. So, okay, I think that'll pretty much do it. Okay, here's an example. Let's use this. I've got this thing here. Okay. Now, what we've got here, hope you're not getting dizzy looking at watching this. This is a Greek, what's called black and white Attic ware vase. It's actually Corinth. It would be from Corinth, slightly north of Athens. So this would be from the classical Greek period. And it would reflect some sort of story. To the life of me, I can never remember what this particular story is. There's two parts to it here. They're linked together. So it's like two scenes. Think of this like a really early version of a manga. So this is basically a story here, and someone paid to have this particular piece made with these stories plugged into it. Okay, so this would be an example of attic ware. Now, if you're an anthropologist, of course, there's the original one to date from the classical Greek period. So when Athens had the Parthenon and all the rest of that stuff. Now, if you're, or I should say, if you're actually if you're an archaeologist like me, Now, one of the interesting things is when Greece collapses and the Romans take it over, it becomes a colony of Rome. The Romans were really big on Greek stuff like this. So what you find is it's now 600 years after the original one of these would have been made. What you find in the Roman period, 600 years later, is a bunch of people doing knockoffs of the original Greek one because wealthy Romans, especially sort of new money wealthy Romans, want to have a bunch of these things lying around their house to show how sophisticated they are. Because to be sophisticated and be Roman which meant you went to Greek schools and you learned Greek literature and stuff. And so this became the way to sort of identify that I knew that stuff. In the same way they might have a PhD diploma on your office or something like that to prove that you had intellectual aspirations, that you'd done something. So the Romans were really big on this. Now they weren't collecting the originals, which were all pretty much bust up. They were collecting copies, and they were okay with that. The Romans were very comfortable with the idea that some guy would literally sort of knock off a couple hundred of these you can buy them at something like a version of Ross's or Macy's or something like that. That was all cool, because as far as they knew, every other Roman looked at these and realized that what you were trying to say is, I know what these stories are, which means I've got training, or I'm educated. Okay, then everything disappears. Rome collapses, medieval period shows up. By the time of the Renaissance and the late medieval period, the Europeans were really, really big on Greek and Roman stuff. Not the realities of Greek and Roman stuff, but sort of the mythos they'd made Greek and Roman society into. So again, what happens is your intellectual elites, but more important, your political elites, the guys with folks, nobility in Europe, start to collect Greek and Roman stuff because they want to show that they've got classical training. You have to remember, at Puna till fairly recently, I think Iolani did till really recently, still taught Latin in school. There's not a lot of use for Latin in the 21st century, but they taught it because that was part of what's called classical education. You guys get this idea of liberal arts education that's based in the European idea of what the Greek and Romans taught, which is totally wrong, by the way, but nonetheless, it's part of that. So in that context, what you're going to get if you're wealthy and you want to look educated by the 1600s, you go and get some guy to dig some of these up from Rome or some other place where the Romans were hanging around. Mind you, they're not the originals. They're still the Roman knockoffs. But that's okay because you want to look like them. Now, what you do is if you can't afford or you can't find any of these, then guess what? There's a whole new industry that starts up where people basically make 17th and 18th century copies of the Roman copies of the Greek originals. If you're getting a little dizzy, it gets even worse. Okay? So that then becomes what people acquire. And you'll find these all over the place in Europe. Some pretty weird looking ones, which are basically supposed to be copies of Greek and Roman stuff. And man, they're not even close. But the guy that paid for them really didn't care because it was the idea of them sitting on a shelf, which was important because it bragged to all his friends. I know what this is about. So he's not really worried about how authentic it is in terms of history. It's what it says about him that's important. It's a status symbol. Okay, now we segue forward. Tourism starts up in the 19th, 20th century and gets going in the 20th century. By the 1950s and 60s, you get tons of tourists. And one of the huge places that tourists love to go is places like Greece. And when they go to some place like that, they want to bring back stuff. And you want to have that stuff be something visible so you can put it in your office. And you can have everyone say, wow, you must have gone to Greece. Yeah, I went, I took this 3-day course at something, the British Institute in Athens. I learned all about these Greek vases and the story of, I don't know, we'll just say Euripides and Euripides or something like that. And so, and this is, this. So on one hand, you're still applying some sort of intellectual points. You know what this means and it says something about you. Now you're also applying that you have enough money and sophistication to go to Greece and get this thing. Okay. So now you've got, in many cases, of course, this is intentionally a knockoff of, I don't know, I'm starting to lose track of how many places we've gone back, of something that actually happened about 2,000 years earlier. Okay. Now this is even worse. I bought this on eBay for, I think, $5. It's made in China. And it's bought by people too, I know, and uses decoration. So if you think about it, now we got something that's made in China as a knockoff of a Greek tourist vase that was made in the 1950s. That's a knockoff of a Renaissance period vase. That's a knockoff of a Roman vase. That's a knockoff of the Greek original. Okay. Now, of course, when you're buying this on eBay for $5, you didn't go to Greece, and you have no reason to have this. Then you want to put it in your office or something and imply I was at Greece, or I might have gone to Greece. Okay, so people go, damn, I never been to Greece. So when you're looking at this from an anthropological standpoint, one, you've got the object, but now what you might want to just do for a minute or two, if you want to make yourself dizzy, is using one or more of these theories, is trying to figure out what the hell's going on with this, like how functional is it? Now I guarantee for the guys that make this stuff, it's really functional. They're selling the damn things. In terms of the people buying it, I don't know, functional approach, I can do a little bit of that, but I sort of lose track after a while. From a it makes a lot more sense to me from a phenomenological existentialist approach. Why one person's going to buy this on eBay versus another person is going to probably radically differ, but there's some commonalities because I got to have some reason why they think something that's fake Greek is relevant or value that they're willing to cough up the cash for it. So in the same way, the Hatsune Miku was a little bit weird. We'll end up with our weird looking little not Greek, not Roman vase from China. That should keep everyone totally confused for at least part of another week.